indivisible, for liberty and justice for all. Thanks. Item number 3 is a legal update from Jessica Richmond-Smith, our school counsel.
Yes, good afternoon. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. So I think with the exception of Lisa, you all have heard my training. And so I wanted to do something, and I spoke with Lisa Barbiero and Steve. I wanted to do something that was not necessarily repetitive of what you've already heard, although some of what I will share is a little bit repetitive. So I thought it would be helpful to give you a legislative update and share some highlights of what the General Assembly has done to you this year. And then, so that's the first part of the presentation. And then the second part of the presentation is kind of a refresher on board roles and responsibilities. I will highlight some things to be thinking about for this year. I don't have FOIA as part of my slides, but I'm happy to ad-lib. I know FOIA in my sleep. And I'm also happy to just answer any questions that you have or things, talk about anything that might be on your mind related to board roles and responsibilities and FOIA or anything else. So as I said, these are the highlights. I think you have in your packet, right? In your packet, you all have, maybe you don't, but if you don't, I can get it to you. Our firm puts out every year a comprehensive update on changes to the legislation affecting education. And what I've done here is I've grabbed the changes that I think would be most relevant to you as board members or just interesting to you. But this is by no means all of the changes. So if you want to see all of them, then I can certainly have our comprehensive update shared with you. You may wonder, where did these changes come from? I'm not sure I'll be able to answer those questions for you, but I will say that the CEA, the Connecticut Education Association, which is the local teachers union, does have a great amount of influence with the legislature. There are other interest groups, parent groups, and others that are in the ear of different legislators. And so this and then the organizations that represent boards of education, the organizations that represent superintendents, educators, they all whisper in the ears, maybe a little more loudly than whispering, of the legislators, and out comes the changes that you'll see presented today. So I'm going to start with a big one. You may all have heard that there are fairly significant changes to Title IX effective this past August 1st, 2024. Title IX happens to be something that I work a lot on. So I will just give you a little bit of a historical context here. So August 1st, 2020 was the first time that there was a major sea change in the Title IX regulations. And what happened in August of 2020 was that we had a completely different Title IX landscape. We had a definition of sexual harassment for the first time under federal law, and that definition was a very high standard, okay? So what that meant is that only conduct that was severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive, or that was a sexual assault, fell under Title IX under federal law. So everything else really was not within the scope of Title IX. It certainly could have been within the scope of state law, but it was not within the scope of Title IX. There were also significant changes to the procedural requirements required of Title IX investigations, and that put an enormous burden on your administration to investigate these issues. And it was really that the changes were really intended to address issues that were happening at the higher ed level. And what was came to be understood was that the changes were not as K-12 friendly. So the changes, fast forward 4 years, and the changes we see now, number one, expand the scope of Title IX coverage because the definition of sexual harassment is now a lower threshold, but also the changes were designed to really relieve some of that burden, particularly at the K-12 level on the administration. So for example, it used to be that your administrators had to assign potentially 4 different people to be involved in a Title IX investigation. one investigator who collected the facts and a separate decision maker who decided, whether a Title IX violation had occurred. And those two people couldn't communicate at all because of conflict of interest issues. That's no longer the case. It's not required. You can have one person or one team of people doing that investigation and making those decisions. Also, the definition of, it's now called sex-based harassment, has changed, and it's a much more expansive definition. It's basically the same as the definition of sexual harassment under Connecticut law. It's severe or pervasive, as opposed to severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive. So we're going to see a lot more conduct coming within the scope of Title IX. Finally, the other major change, and this has really been the source of all the litigation that you might be hearing about around the country, and P.S., these regulations are enjoined in 26 states the last time I checked, meaning they can't even be enforced by the Department of Education. They also are enjoined in particular schools, including schools in Connecticut. And the reason is that the coverage of Title IX has expanded to include sex-based characteristics, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and so sex stereotypes, et cetera. And that's really been the source of litigation around the country related to Title IX. As far as I know, and the list keeps growing, there are no schools in the Weston Public Schools that are where the injunction applies. So what that means is that you are following these new regulations. Why am I sharing this all with you? Because the board is going to have to pretty quickly review and adopt a new Title IX policy and procedures, which I think are in your folder, that implement the new federal laws and regulations. So that is Title IX. And I'm going to skip one of my slides for a minute, and then I'll circle back. I also, relatedly, while we're on the subject of policies and major changes, the bullying law changed last year, and it changed pretty significantly. So another thing that the policy committee will need to be looking at is adopting an updated bullying law that implements the changes that were adopted last year to bullying. And what were those changes? The definition of bullying changed. There's a new category of behavior called challenging behavior. Bullying there's a much higher threshold for what constitutes bullying behavior under the new law, and there's a much lower threshold for what's now called challenging behavior. If you're interested in what those definitions are, they're this. So bullying, so starting in 2025, you can adopt the policy earlier, but starting July 1st next year, you will have to adopt this new policy. And under the new policy, bullying will be defined as unwanted and aggressive behavior among children in grades K-12 inclusive that involves a real or perceived power imbalance. That's really different than the current definition, which says that a single act that is pervasive, severe, persistent, or pervasive can be an act of bullying. So the definition of bullying, the threshold has greatly increased in order to meet that definition. However, you have this new thing called challenging behavior, which has a much lower threshold. So behavior that might have been called bullying before will be called challenging behavior starting in 2025. What is challenging behavior? It's behavior that negatively impacts school climate, or interferes or is at risk of interfering with the learning or safety of a student or the safety of a school employee. So for the first time, we see that school employees could be the victims of challenging behavior. And I suspect that that's going to create some interesting scenarios for your administrators going forward. So those are the two major changes to the laws that will affect your students and your staff members. Just as an FYI, Title IX applies both to students and to employees. So I'm skipping around a bit, but speaking of students, the other interesting change that we see that will affect students is that, so the legislature for years has been trying to curb the ever-expanding implementation of student discipline. And we see this change in many, many ways, but the latest iteration of it is that there are now limits on in-school suspension. So I don't know how much you all know about in-school versus out-of-school suspensions, but long story short, when you hear families saying, oh, that child should have been punished, but they weren't punished. They were in school. Well, the reason for that is that the law defaults to in-school suspensions. Some people call it a lunch detention, but it's actually, you cannot suspend a child out of school unless they pose a threat to the health or safety of the environment. The default, this was changed a number of years ago, is to keeping the child basically in the principal's office. So you could have done that for up to 10 days because anything beyond 10 days is an expulsion and that has to go before the board. Now, you can't do that for more than 5 days. Okay? So that's a big change. And then
What happens in practicality, Lisa, if that's the case?
If a student
In-school
needs to
suspension,
be receive an in-school suspension,
Yeah,
that is what happens. They
where does the student
they
go?
assigned work. It could be in the counseling office. It could be in the social workers. It's in the main office area. They are monitored by an adult. And most of the time, as Jessica mentioned, the reason for in-school suspension is because we are working to restore the behavior and the practices. I think we talked a little bit about that during the school climate policy committee. And so during that time, there may be some counseling support that happens. There may be a reiteration of lessons that a student needs to review around what the expectation is around behavior in the school, especially if it's kindergartner, well,
Right.
actually, any grade level, to be honest.
yeah.
And then we think about how we are developing that change of behavior before we transition them back into the general mainstream
and if you
classrooms.
get to the end of the 5 days and you don't think the student should be.
Typically, the in-school suspension number of days is outlined before they go out, and they maintain that number of days.
No, but what happens when you get to that number and you still don't think the student should be integrated back into the classroom?
If I may, I think it really depends on
Yeah.
what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there could also be a combination of in-school and out-of-school if it was a really severe situation, for example. We've seen that, but generally, we state how many days, and the goal is always to bring them back. And, several years ago, or maybe it's many years ago now, we got away from out-of-school suspension because, the whole idea of bringing them in, making them accountable, making them productive, that whole kind of restorative practice thing is important than just sending them, well, you're being suspended for 5 days out of school. We want them in school because then what? In some places, they would just stay home and sleep late and do whatever. So if we reduce it from 10 to 5, we find that it works. If there was a situation where it might be 3 out and 5 in, but again, that's generally a real serious situation. Am I clarifying that?
And there's progressions.
Yeah,
right?
except there's some easing of some of this as it relates to whether it's violent or not.
if it's violent, then it would probably be out of school. And the idea is that you would work with the family and the student to come up with a way for the student to reenter safely. And that might involve a special education team. It might involve a diagnostic placement. I mean, usually in those kinds of situations, there are other things happening and there are ways to figure that out.
Yeah, I mean, we could be moving towards expulsion, to be frank, in some egregious situation.
Right. And then it would be a 10-day out-of-school suspension with a
Exactly.
recommendation for
It
expulsion.
wouldn't be a combo or anything like that.
Yeah, in-school suspension is usually reserved for lesser offenses. And, it's not used for a situation where a student presents a risk to the health or safety of the community.
But the question I asked you about early grade suspension, where the threshold was the student had to do physical harm.
Right, which is this, yeah.
I don't, why would anyone allow that to escalate to the point before you could react as an administration? It just doesn't make
To
any
what
sense.
escalate? I'm sorry, I'm not following.
it was softened to say, and I sent Jessica a question about this, that early grade suspensions, they changed it to require physical harm before the child could be suspended. I don't understand why they would, it used to be a lesser level of activity, but now it has to be physical harm before the school can react?
Right, so this is early grades, this is the next point that, the next change to the suspension law. So kids in preschool to grade 2, it used to be that they could be suspended out of school for conduct on school grounds that was of a violent or sexual nature and that endangers persons. The change is that the conduct has to be on school grounds and must be behavior that causes physical harm. And it also reduces the maximum length for those suspensions from 10 to 5. So why did they do that? I don't know.
This is out of school.
Right, this is out of
This
school.
isn't in school.
Yeah, I don't understand why they would lessen, the student
This-
has to do
The
something.
threshold?
The threshold, yeah.
From 10 to
I mean,
5.
Probably.
Something really bad has to happen before you can suspend a kid out of school,
Hours.
yeah. I don't know, I just asked Jessica why.
Right, actually, I think I read this threshold as being lower, because it used to be that the kids had to do something that was of a violent or sexual nature that endangered persons. Now it's behavior that causes physical harm. I mean, it depends on how you read it, but
And this is a state law?
yes. It's hard to know where
And
these changes come
Who
from.
lobbies the state for this?
This, that was that article that I sent you.
Yeah.
I don't really know. I don't really know. I mean, I think it's a combination of the Connecticut Education Association and parent groups, and it's hard to know how the sausage is made.
And this goes to what committee for these things? The education committee in the legislature?
I believe so, yeah.
Just I have a question on that. You want us to wait until you're done?
No, no, please. No.
Going back a couple of slides
Mhm.
where you mentioned that something was in the past required 3 or 4 administrators to administer, now it's 1.
Yes.
So the concern I always have with those types of situations, if one person who's essentially the judge, the jury, and the executioner,
Mm-hmm.
is how do you know it's fair and balanced?
Mm.
And how do you get parental involvement?
Yeah.
This has come up, I've asked this question even about our own policies.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say to parents who may
Yeah.
say, I think part of what Steve is saying is decisions have been made for us by people who are not sure who made those decisions. Ultimately, I guess we probably voted them into office, though, but who knows who these people really are? What would you say to us
Yeah.
as a district to make sure that parents are still, they have some level of involvement, and then from an administration perspective, make sure that we don't have an administrator making decisions who then bears all of the responsibility, because I think that opens up the liability.
Sure. So I can say, I could probably spend an hour responding to that question, so I'll try to keep it down. Let me start with Title IX. So this slide has to do with Title IX. Title IX happens to be, have a set of procedures that comes along with it that provides more due process to the respondent, the person who's accused, than any other law that you're subject to here in Connecticut. It's just, it provided even more under the 2020 regulations. Now it provides slightly less, but still, if you actually read these regulations, which you may when it comes to the board, you will see that even though and by the way, we recommend a team of administrators, that we have a team of administrators involved in Title IX investigations, meaning maybe it's the principal and 2 assistant principals or 1 assistant principal working together. They have to be trained, and I'm coming to train them all, on what's the definition of conflict of interest, what's the definition of bias, how do we avoid it. But they have, there is ample due process afforded under those regulations to respondents in those situations, and those families do have the right to appeal the determination. The appeal decision maker has to be somebody who was not involved in the investigation and the determination. And ultimately, even if their appeal is denied, they can file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, right? Anybody can, a complainant or a respondent. So that process, I think you can feel very comfortable that the regulations themselves, if they're implemented correctly, which they will be, afford a great amount of parental involvement and opportunity to avoid conflict of interest and bias. Your other kind of bread and butter investigations, like a bullying investigation, there is no such requirements. But they also actually, families, both the victim and the perpetrator, have the right, if bullying is determined to have occurred, they both have the right to appeal to the State Board of Education. They don't have the right to appeal to the Weston Board of Education, but they have the right to appeal to the State Board of Education, and it's required that the administration provide them with notice of those rights. And so there is an outlet for that, but I think that the parental interaction comes in developing the safety and support plans for the student. Because ultimately, that's what's, I think, most important, is that the student who is alleged to have been the perpetrator of this conduct and the student who's alleged to have been the victim, that the conduct stop, right? And that they feel, or even if it didn't occur, that the students feel supported. And I always recommend, and I know your administrators do this, that they have conversations with families to figure out what supports can we put in place at the beginning while we're investigating and at the end to make sure that the students feel supported in school.
So would you just generally say, it sounds like the bar to have a sex-based harassment has been lowered? Which
Yes.
I think is what we've been talking about. But, so the bar's been lowered, but the rights of the accused have been higher or about the same?
I would say they're about the same. It used to be that the accused, I would say they're less, to be fair, but they're still, even under the change, they still have more due process, meaning more rights to present their side than they would in any other school-based investigation because of the way the procedures work. For example, when a Title IX investigation begins, there's complete symmetry of in no other investigation is there complete symmetry of information between the victim and the accused. So if I were a victim asking that the district investigate Title IX, the process starts with a notice of allegations that says, you have been accused by Jessica Smith of this, and here's what you've been accused of. And throughout the process, both parties have the right to inspect the evidence, to inspect the notes of the administration, to inspect anything that is turned up by the investigator before the investigator makes a determination of responsibility. That doesn't happen in any of your other investigations. It definitely doesn't happen in bullying. There's FERPA, protects the rights of students. And by the way, under Title IX, the accused, if they're ultimately determined to be responsible and they're ultimately suspended, for example, the victim gets to know that. That's the only time when the victim gets to know the disciplinary consequence of the perpetrator. So, so to answer your question, yes, there's slightly less protections for respondents, but they're still much more significant than they are in any other context.
My last question on this is, and if a student is found responsible and they are suspended, that goes into their file. Is this something that stays with them forever, or this is something that can be removed at a certain point? Like, what is the potential consequences?
That's a little harder to answer. Disciplinary records are expunged automatically upon graduation. But this question comes up a lot when colleges ask school districts for information about a student's disciplinary history, particularly around Title IX violations. And in that case, the family, the student, if they're 18 or older, they have to provide a FERPA release saying that the school district has permission to share that information. Expulsion records can be expunged in certain circumstances. Suspension records can be expunged in certain circumstances. So long story short, your student discipline policy governs how long those records of discipline last. Separately, records related to Title IX must be maintained by the school district for a period of 7 years. So whether or not those records live in a student's cumulative file is a separate question, but a school district's Title IX obligations are obligations that attach to the school district. And by the way, the burden of proof of proving any Title IX allegation is on the district. It's not on the victim. So it's this strange world we live in where it's the district that has to comply with Title IX. So all of those records of compliance have to be maintained for 7 years, no matter what.
Just a quick follow-up. So our structure in our district, is it a committee of administrators? Is it one person? Is it like a Title IX coordinator? Who ultimately does the decision like dress code? Is it a person or is it?
I'm happy to jump in here because you probably haven't decided that yet,
Not
right?
yet.
So I can jump in with what we recommend, but
Yeah, no, go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah.
I would just say that these changes to the law do impact the way that we investigate, but it has been our practice to never have one person investigate, one administrator investigate a situation completely, because of the complex nature of this. We are much more comfortable, as is with other, practices where you've got short-term rentals. It's a really seamless situation. Usually assistant principals would work together, each parents would be athletic director would work together to determine this. And now with the changes, and what Jessica's saying, the thunder, it used to be all the investigator and then someone would review. Now, that team can actually reach a conclusion if you will. However, if it's appeal, you don't have to be someone that wasn't involved at all in the process within our system.
So we can't have like, some of the gentlemen that tonight's agenda was supposed to be approving the arbiter, for, residency issues and things like that.
Expulsion.
Expulsion.
Yes.
Would that be the person that's a third party outside the district that would then?
No.
No?
No,
Okay.
it's not that.
Then I misunderstood. All right.
Yeah, no, that's separate. What we're approving tonight is if we were going to expel someone, we have, we take the burden off of the local board to make that decision, put an impartial, arbitrator,
Yeah, so
Hearing
we're gonna use
officer.
a person outside of none of
Yeah,
us,
yeah, yeah.
none of the
No,
administrators.
No, not here. It would be, for example, it would come to Tracy Edwards, or it could come to me.
So it would be a person in the administration that would make the ultimate decision then?
No, not the ultimate, but the appeal.
Okay.
But I think to Sharon's point, so are we as a board, and it actually might be directed towards Lisa or Tina, tonight, or is the district's policy, I think what you were kind of alluding to, Jessica, is that depending on what's in the district policy guideline, sort of is going to shape how we address the new requirements, and it could be one person, it could be four. I have a concern if it's just one person. So as a district, when do we discuss that and make that determination?
So I can answer that. So it's actually, just to be clear, it's not in the district's policy, or this is our model policy. It's not in the policy, it's in the administrative regulations, which I believe, and I would have to check your bylaws, but I believe, like most districts, Lisa administratively adopts regulations. You don't adopt them as the board. You'll read them, you'll make sure you're good with them, and you always have the right to say, no, I don't like these, and direct changes. But you're not going to be adopting those. That's kind of a small point. But David, to answer your question, in our model administrative regulations, this is how it reads with respect to your question. The district will provide for the adequate, reliable, and impartial investigation of complaints. In most circumstances, the district will institute a unified investigative model in which an administrator or a team of administrators will serve as both the investigator and the decision maker. In rare circumstances, the Title IX coordinator may implement a bifurcated investigative model in which the investigator and the decision maker are separate administrators or separate teams. So one, like the old rules, one would make the investigate and one would make the decision. But we said the reason we framed it this way is because that's really hard for your administration to do. So the way this reads is that it's there's a lot of latitude, but as Lisa was saying, typically you will use a team. I don't really see a reason why you wouldn't, unless for some reason you didn't have enough people who were not conflicted somehow. And by the way, the definition of conflict of interest is very specific, and in most cases, nobody's going to have a conflict of interest. So that's how your regulations read.
Well, should that not be codified? Because I always say, when there's things up for interpretation, there's things up for debate. So the way that your guidance reads is it can be one person, it can be a team of people.
Right.
It can be unified, it can be bifurcated. Is that something that should be codified?
Well, the reason we did it this way is because I recommend that you preserve flexibility for your administration. And, because you never know what situation will come up. If you require that it always be this one particular way, there's no room for them to depart from that. Because they're regulations, Lisa could on her own say, you know what, I'm changing these, right? Not that she would do that without the board's, under the bylaws. I'm assuming your bylaws are like everybody else's, where she would have to let you know. She would have to provide you with notification that she's changing the administrative regulations. But this language, it might be the case that it's always best practice. Lisa might decide, Tina might decide that it's always best practice to use a unified model, but you never know what situation might arise where you only have one person who can be involved because the rest are in business with, have a conflict of interest because they're in business with one of the families. Who knows? But some degree of flexibility, I think, is appropriate.
And I would agree, and just putting this aside, whenever there's a situation where, let's say, something is going on and the complaint comes to me, that's important that I'm not involved in, like, something going on at the school level or something else. It's not necessarily under Title IX. The administrators handle it, because if there's a complaint and the complaint comes to me, I don't get involved in investigating. I have to be sort of, okay, now I'm gonna look at this and I'll make a decision. If you look at our complaint policy. Like, I'm not happy with this particular outcome, it could be.
And just because I know that it's confusing, just so you all know, you're going to be appointing a impartial hearing officer to hear expulsion hearings tonight. What that means, that's separate from what's going on here, because what that means is that whoever is making this decision about Title IX can only recommend expulsion because of the way the statute works. Expulsions are not self-executing. Okay, so they can, any other discipline, the investigator will say, yep, the kid did it, it violates Title IX, and the student will be suspended for 5 days. But if it's a serious situation and expulsion is the discipline that's recommended, a decision, a Title IX investigator, decision maker cannot say, and this student is now expelled. Because there is a separate Connecticut law, 10-233D, that provides students with due process rights when expulsion is recommended. And that's why you have, it's either the board or the impartial hearing officer that you will be appointing. That's who says, okay, yep, I see the Title IX report, I see the recommendation, and yes, this student is going to be expelled. So you have yet another layer of due process if expulsion is recommended.
So that person would be the person to complete the expulsion, but it would be with other steps based upon the fact that it's a Title IX specific offense,
Yeah,
correct?
that person would be in charge solely of approving the expulsion.
Right.
And the situation's a little odd because to relitigate the whole thing would be bizarre.
Right. No, but I mean, that's why I was confused, because I did think
is
that this would be the
confusing.
person who would be doing the expulsion, but what you're saying is
But
that.
if we're expelling, we might not be expelling.
Correct,
Yeah.
right. So we would come to the conclusion and make the recommendation to this third party, who is the out-of-district third party, who then would enforce,
Right,
put the enforcement in place or whatever.
right.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
That makes sense now.
Yeah, and not to confuse the issue further, but under Title IX, there's a right to an appeal. So if the party's appealed, you'd have that go through the process before it gets to the expulsion hearing officer.
Okay, so now we have something in which, especially if this is some sort of a, sexual, that's going on where we have the victim and we have the perpetrator, if you will, which sounds like a terrible thing to say, but we haven't expelled this person, and now we have, how do we handle that as far as the school district is concerned? Is it just sending them out for, how is it that we manage the, how is it we look after the victim?
I can answer legally what you're required to do, and then they can answer. Yeah, so under Title IX, by the way, I appreciate all these questions, because as I said, this happens to be my area, one of my areas. So under Title IX, you have always, since 2020, been required to provide what's called supportive measures to both, and the word is actually respondent instead of perpetrator under Title IX, and the victim, it's actually, the word is complainant. So the district is required to provide supportive measures to both the complainant and the respondent from the beginning. And what that means, what are supportive measures? Supportive measures are supposed to be designed to restore the complainant's access to their education, to the school district while the investigation is pending. And at the conclusion, they may be made more permanent. So if it's determined that a student actually engaged in sex-based harassment of a victim, what we would be looking at is how can we ensure that the complainant can continue to go to school, that that student can continue to feel safe and comfortable in school. And I deal with this all the time. I mean, I deal with, like at the high school level, some really serious things where you have a student who was found to have sexually assaulted another student. And people can't believe, how can that student be permitted to go to school? Well, they might be expelled for a period of time, but you can't expel a student for longer than a year. And so at some point, they might be in school together, and there are lots of ways to deal with that, but one simple way is to make sure that those students never come in contact with each other, that they're not in the same classes. I have school districts that create maps of the hallways so that the students avoid each other even as they cross each other in the hallways. There's extra monitoring and security in the lunchroom. It's ensured that they have different lunch waves and the like. As a practical matter, in really serious situations like that, the administration is often able to work with the families to come up with something, that student who engaged in sexual assault, and that's a really extreme example, but that student might be placed somewhere else. In less extreme examples where you just have really egregious conduct that's more of your standard, sending sex-based pictures, sexual pictures, calling names and the like, similar kind of idea, but the idea is to make sure that there's not a hostile environment for the victim.
So that being said, prior to expulsion, while it's still being investigated, both the respondent and the claimant they both have the right to an education, so they are both in the same facility. Perhaps one is in an in-school suspension.
No.
Or, no?
Nope.
You can't.
You
no
can't- you
disciplinary action can be taken until the completed research.
Exactly.
So how is it you ensure that the complainant feels safe?
By working, to David's point before, by working with the complainant and their family to come up with a plan that everybody has input into to help the complainant, restore the complainant's access.
Okay.
We can't always do everything that the family wants, but the idea is to try. And by the way, under the new regulations, complainants and respondents now have the right to challenge supportive measures. So, as I said, I could go on and on about these rules, but they have the right to formally challenge the supportive measures, and then somebody other than the person who instituted them has to make the decision as to whether the challenge should prevail or whether it should not prevail.
And by supportive measures, that could mean something that would affect the respondents day-to-day. Okay,
Yes.
so that's why there's a challenge opportunity for them.
For either of them. I mean, the complainant might say, you know what, this isn't enough, and the respondent might say, this is unfairly burdens me, because the supportive measures at the outset can't burden either the complainant or the respondent, and they can't be punitive.
Okay,
At the end, they can.
right, okay. Whew. We can get into the weeds on this one, that's it.
So all of your administrators, by the way, I think, will be trained on this, and you should feel happy that you're not in that training because it takes 3 hours and it really, you think we got into the weeds today? Those poor administrators. But that training is now an annual requirement, and all your employees have to be trained annually in a kind of a lighter version of this. All right, moving on to something hopefully a little simpler, high school graduation requirements. So these seem to change every year too. I don't know how familiar you all are with the mastery-based diploma assessment. It used to be under the old law that boards of ed were permitted to include that as one of the graduation requirements, but they didn't have to. Now that language is eliminated, and so what does that mean? What that means is that, so you probably, how many credits do you require for graduation? Okay, so that's what the statute requires, right? So some boards of ed require more than 25. And it used to be, so for you all, it used to be that you could count that as one of the 25, but now you can't. So, you know, you could add it, so you could have 26 credits. But now the provision allowing you to count that as one of the 25 has been eliminated.
Wasn't this mastery-based diploma assessment, wasn't this just put into practice like a few years ago?
Yeah,
Okay, so they're just changing that one.
right, right. Do you have mastery-based diploma?
It's the portrait of the graduate, the portfolio.
Right. So that's something that you all would want to think about. Again, you could add it, right? But it can't be one of the, my interpretation of the law is that can't be one of the 25. And then personal financial management and financial literacy. So under current law, beginning with the graduating class of 2027, students are required to complete a half credit in these subjects, which could count toward the students' humanities or electives. And this requirement can now count towards students' STEM credit requirement.
Boy, our students don't graduate knowing how to balance checkbook?
I'm right there with you, Brandon, yes. And just so you know, we've known about this, we've been working towards this, how are we gonna incorporate it? Same thing with the portrait of a graduate, I mean, those of us, I think a lot of you came to hear the presentations, we love that. We just have to be aware about how it translates into credits, and credits, there are a minimum amount of our credits that you need to graduate, and a very high majority of our students will be on that, because that's who we are. You know, when you have 40% of seniors taking 2 math courses, it's gonna be fun. We're just working for it, and we're gonna have to obviously bring it forward because it's one of the policies is the graduate requirements. And I know Dr. Engel's been spending a lot of time on talking about this. And just this past summer, right, the gentleman that teaches personal finance is all involved taking a course and everything else, how to improve the program with the idea that this has to become a requirement.
Really quickly, community service. Now partisan political activities can qualify as community service if you offer a credit in community service. Phys ed, now a physician's assistant in addition to a physician or an APRN can excuse a student from phys ed. I've already talked about the changes to the bullying policy, so I don't know that we need to spend more time on that. Paid sick leave, this is more of a heads up for negotiations. So one of the things I'll remind you of at the end is that you have teacher and administrator negotiations coming up this summer. You have negotiations with your non-certified employees, your paraprofessionals, your custodians, your maintenance workers coming up the following spring. And so one of the things to keep in mind is that the Connecticut paid sick leave law has changed, and it now applies to Board of Ed employees. And what it means is that the first 40 hours of sick leave that are accrued by any Board of Ed employee have to be used in accordance with that law. And long story short, that law lets employees use sick leave to care for a lot of different people. Not just immediate family, but close affiliations. The definition is here. family members, spouse, child, including adult child, parent, grandparent, grandchild, sibling of an employee, or an individual related to the employee by blood or affinity whose close association to the employee is equivalent to those family relationships. So this has come up a lot with when I negotiate contracts, because the first basically 5 days of sick leave that any employee accrues, they can use to care for any of these people. All right, HVAC. There are a lot of changes to HVAC inspection laws. I don't know that we need to get too much into the weeds on this, but just be aware that there are some pretty significant new requirements. I don't know how familiar you are with this, but the deadline has been postponed. But so it used to be that by January 1st of 2025, boards had to conduct HVAC inspections and evaluations within each school building every 5 years and in accordance with statutory standards. So under the change, there's a staggered schedule for those inspections. So for each year beginning July 1st, 2026 and up through June 30th, 2031, that boards must conduct a uniform inspection of at least 20% of school buildings under their jurisdiction until each building is inspected, and then every 5 years after that. There is a provision to get a waiver in certain circumstances on the starting time for that, but it's pretty limited. Reserve funds. So it used to be that a town board of finance, board of selectmen, or other town funding authority for a school district was authorized to deposit an unexpended portion of the education funds into a non-lapsing account, not to exceed 2% of the budgeted appropriation for the prior year, and provided that expenditures from that account were authorized by the board. Now the board can do that. And I think that's going to be a pretty big change for a lot of boards, because I've spent a lot of time trying to help towns and boards talk through this, but now the board can do that itself.
But it doesn't change the ultimate destination is for towns generally.
Exactly.
No, that's not right. No. If we can, this says we no longer have to turn back unexpended funds to the town.
Right, only
We
for
can
education
create
purposes.
effectively our own reserve fund.
Right, I'm sorry, right, but I heard what you said is ultimately the town approves your budget and gives you the money. But yeah, it's your own non-lapsing account that you deposit funds into.
So that's the change?
Yes,
That's the change.
not the town.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Years past, we turn back to the town.
No, yeah.
So the change is that now if there is money left over at the end of the school year, we can put it into a non-lapsing account that is restricted to Board of Education.
That's right.
Yes, I think though, this is just my own interpretation, and you all can tell me if you've experienced it differently. As a practical matter, I don't know how much has changed other than a possible fight with the town, because it always had to be expended for educational purposes approved by the board. It was
So,
just,
historically, when I was in the Board of Finance, Phil, for 2 or 3 years, advocated for this. And the Board of Finance turned it down. Phil always said, we want to keep the money, we will not spend it except with your approval, and the board said no. But now, to Jessica's early comment, this is going to be an interesting conversation. If we say to the Board of Finance, we have $1, I'm not going to give it back to you, we're going to keep it for ourselves, and it's a conversation that needs to be, I don't know what's the right term, massaged.
so maybe outside of our public discussion, we can talk more about my thoughts on the practical implications of this, but it may not have any practical effect. All right, there's ARPA funds that the state is going to be distributing for PD, for your professional development for your paraeducators, which is good.
So we should have it.
I'm sorry?
So then we should have.
You
it.
should, September 1st, but you know, who knows with the state. So maybe check in with them if you don't have it. This slide has way too much text in it, so long story short, there are a bunch of changes regarding school building projects. I threw this in here because I know that there is a school building project that's out there here in Weston, and so I wanted you all to be aware that there are some changes related to requirements for funding, state funding for school building projects. For example, a solar feasibility study. There's beginning with applications submitted on and after July 1st, 2026, the local share has to include an additional 10% contingency in accordance with guidance provided by the Department of Administrative Services. So I'm sure you'll all learn this, you know, at the appropriate time, but there are some changes which you can read at your leisure. Also kind of related to the idea of school building project requirements, new playgrounds have to be designed in accordance with universal design principles. What is universal design? It's design that is adaptable or suitable for a variety of children without having to make additional accommodations. So that is for any playgrounds designed on or after July 1st, 2025. School bus seatbelt program. So this new law reestablishes and makes permanent a program to provide funding to support the purchase of school buses equipped with 3-point lap and shoulder safety belts. So you can, beginning next October, districts can submit an application for the program to the DMV. Applications have to include a proposed agreement between the district and a private school bus company, et cetera. I threw these in here just to let you know that, and this is more for your administration, the mandates that the General Assembly places on school districts over time have become untenable. And I hear this a lot from my clients. I know that the Connecticut Association of School Superintendents has been advocating for mandate relief. It's been something that I've been hearing about personally for 10 years. So finally, we see that the General Assembly has paid attention and has committed to review this. What will come out of it remains to be seen, but suffice it to say that your administration has a lot of things that it has to do just to comply with the law before they can even do the work that they do for the students of Weston, and it's a lot. So the legislature is looking at that. And finally, this is interesting. AI, I'm sure, is on a lot of our minds, and that is also a subject that's being studied as to how it can most effectively be implemented in schools. 5 boards of ed representing different types of school districts will be selected to participate in a pilot program to study the use of AI. So if you're interested, there it is. There's also a public school assessment audit, again, looking at standardized exams and how they're implemented, and trying to examine whether any of them can be changed or reduced to more effectively implement what they're designed to do, which is to aid instruction. So that concludes the education legislation update. As I said, that's, I would say, probably 10 or 15% of the changes that were made this year. There are a lot, but I just wanted to highlight the ones that were possibly most relevant to the board. Maybe more like 25%. Any other questions about that? Okay.
Can I just add some clarification on this policy, because these are really dense and we purposefully did not put them on this month's agenda. The policy subcommittee got a heads up. We wanted to provide you the copies with it. The administrators are going through the training. We will be revisiting it October, November, because there's a lot here. We want to make sure that everyone has a thorough understanding, and if they want to, voice any concerns or feedback or need clarification, that there's the time to do that. In the meantime, quite frankly, if there is something, we have to look into something, we will
follow the spirit of these policies, doing things with the team approach, and consulting with our legal counsel.
Yeah, right, we'll leave it there. So board roles and responsibilities, this is a presentation that many of you have seen before, and I don't necessarily, I want to make sure that you feel free to ask questions and share what's on your mind, but I did think it was important to go over what the responsibilities of the board are, particularly as they're distinct from the responsibilities of the administration, and particularly as they're distinct from the responsibilities, if any, of individual board members and committees. Because those are questions that I get a lot. What's my role as an individual board member? What am I supposed to be doing versus what is the administration supposed to be doing? And how does the work of committees relate to the work of the board? So all of this is really designed to help remind you all of that. So the board's responsibilities, first and foremost, I think you all know that you all are an agent of the state of Connecticut. You're not an agent of the town of Weston. You are a subdivision of the state. And as a subdivision of the state, it is your foremost responsibility to implement the state's educational interests. What are the state's educational interests? Well, I just went through some of them. The state's educational interests are spelled out in the state's laws. And I mentioned before that parents have the right to appeal a determination of bullying to the state. And the reason they have that right is really the appeal is a claim that the Board of Education has not implemented the educational interests of the state. Now, that's a really high standard. It's not, oh, I don't like this outcome. It's more, the state would look at it if the board has not adopted a compliant bullying policy, if they haven't followed the appropriate procedures. But policy and procedure are important because they are a way to show that the Board of Education, through its administration, is implementing the state's educational interests. And then along similar lines, how do you make sure you're doing that? Because you employ Superintendent Barbiero, and you act through her. And she is the one who is charged with making sure that you are in compliance with all of the state laws and appropriate regulations and that they're implemented with fidelity. So it's not on you all to go around from school to school and peek in to the offices, but rather to rely on the fact that you have hired a highly competent, sophisticated superintendent, assistant superintendent, administration to do that work for you. One of your most important functions is to establish policies, and most of your policies will be policies that are required by law. For example, Title IX, bullying. As you probably all know, Shipman and Goodwin has model policies, most of which are policies that you're required to adopt by law. And so your work should be fairly easy because those policies really are designed to make sure that you're following the law. So that's one of your important functions. And then you are responsible for making sure that your administration implements those policies, but again, not by, hearing appeals or hearing complaints and dealing with them, but rather by evaluating and overseeing your superintendent, who in turn evaluates and oversees your administration. Of course, establishing the budget is one of your important functions, employing certified staff members, collective bargaining. As I said, you have negotiations with your teachers and administrators coming up. You have negotiations coming up with all your other employees, which obviously impacts your budget. Facilities reviews, community relations, which I know you all think about very seriously here in Weston, curriculum review, adjudication. So this is important. I know you're going to be appointing an impartial hearing officer to hear expulsion matters. So that's how you fulfill your quasi-judicial role when it comes to student expulsions. But the way that could come up is also if you had a recommended termination of a teacher or an administrator. That individual might ask for a hearing before the Board of Education. And it may be that you would appoint somebody impartial to be the hearing officer. It may be that you would do it yourself, but ultimately, that impartial hearing officer has to provide a recommendation to the board, and you would have to vote on the recommendation. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because this is the reason that you all can't really hear much about what's brewing with your teachers and administrators. It's because if you do, and I think most of you have heard me say this before, if you do, it really could compromise your ability to serve impartially if that teacher or administrator requested a hearing regarding Lisa's recommendation for termination. So that's why if you were faced with the unfortunate circumstance where a teacher or an administrator engaged in conduct that became really public and you felt that you needed to know what was going on, why don't I know? Why aren't you sharing it with me? Why am I not getting an update? That's why. Individual board members. So individual board members really have no authority as individuals. You have authority as one member of a team. You have authority sitting around a board table in a board meeting or in a committee meeting. And you don't have the authority to do anything on your own. That being said, one of the things that is in your packet is you and Weston have, this isn't required by law, but you have it in your bylaws, and I think it's a really good thing to have. You have a code of ethics that each of you is required to follow, which is a really good place to start if you want to understand how can I serve as an effective board member. And I'll highlight some of those provisions in a minute, but some of those that I want to call your attention to is number 8. I will recognize that authority rests only with the whole board assembled in meeting and will make no personal promises nor take any private action which may compromise the board. I will acknowledge that the board represents the entire community and will refuse to surrender my independent judgment to special interest or partisan political groups. I will never use my position on the board for personal gain. I will hold confidential all matters discussed in executive session and all information which, if disclosed, might injure individuals or the schools. So again, this is a really helpful roadmap to understand what your obligations are as an individual board member. And I often hear from various boards and various board members, well, my constituents, or I told my constituents, or, you know, and board members don't really have, individual board members don't have constituents. Once you're elected to the board, as I said, you are an agent of the state. And so you work together to make sure that you're implementing the state's interests. But this goes back to number 9, that you really should not be promising individual groups of people or individual people anything, because first of all, you have to make decisions as a board after deliberating as a board. And second of all, no one of you has individual constituents. Jump in, by the way, this should be a dialogue, so feel free to ask questions or make comments.
We do have constituents, if you would say the people of the state of Connecticut are our constituents?
Well, I meant it in a colloquial way, you know, individual, like you might have members of the community who said, you know what, Chad, we think you'd make a great board member. We're going to host a party for you, and we're going to elect you. And I think some board members, not here, but in general, think those are my people, right? Those are and I was elected to represent that group. And that's just not accurate. If what you mean is, who are you ultimately responsible to? I think you're responsible to the members of the Weston community for sure, but you also answer, so to speak, to the state of Connecticut. And how is that? That's because if a member of the community believed that you as a board weren't doing your job, they would make a complaint to the state of Connecticut, who would ultimately adjudicate that complaint. So your chairperson presides over, what's the role of the chairperson? Your chairperson does not have more authority than any of you, but he does have an important role, which is community-facing. First of all, he presides over your meetings. He represents the board publicly. And I know we've talked a lot about this on the communications committee. What does that mean? No individual person, including the person charged with the responsibility to respond, should be making decisions on behalf of the board, but your chairperson communicates things in certain ways, and he is the spokesperson for the board. The chairperson organizes committees, liaises with the superintendent, is not responsible for managing the superintendent or solving problems. Committees. So committees perform work that they're delegated to perform. They make recommendations ultimately. So what's the point of committees? The point of committees is to do the work that would just not be done efficiently by all of you. You all meet how often? Once every 2 weeks? Once every week? Once a month, okay.
Committees meet once a month, board meets once a month.
Okay, so it would be virtually impossible for the board to get things done, all the work that the board has to get done, if you were working together once a month to do that. So committees take on separate responsibilities to maximize the efficiency of the board and ultimately to come up with a unified recommendation to the board so that the board can review it and say, yep, this sounds good. Sometimes that recommendation is sent back to the committee if there are big questions. I'll give policy as an example. If the committee recommends a policy and the board says, well, I think we should think about tweaking this, then it might go back to committee for tweaking. But really the point of a committee is because group work is not very efficient, big group work, and that will help maximize the efficiency of the board. Committees also are public agencies. And I'll just weave in a little bit of FOIA here. So first of all, any group that you all create as a board, or that Lisa creates, maybe that Tina creates as assistant superintendent, is a public agency. Lisa is a public agency herself. She is a one-person public agency. So once a public agency is created, that public agency has to comply with the Freedom of Information Act. So that they have to meet in public, they have to post agendas, they have to post minutes, and all the rules that you have to comply with as a board, your committees have to comply with. Superintendent. So I had fun grabbing her picture. I haven't done that with any of my other presentations, but it was a lovely picture. So your superintendent is your chief executive officer, and that's actually meant literally. That's the term used in the statute. She is your CEO. So she is responsible for enforcing laws, regulations, rules, and policies, making recommendations to you, carrying out your mission, implementing your policies, and appointing certain staff members. So there are certain staff members that you might appoint as a board, and there are certain staff members that your superintendent hires and appoints. And just another point on that. So as a board, there is, beyond the responsibilities that I mentioned at the beginning, there really is not a whole lot of room for you all to get involved in the day-to-day work of the district. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't or that it will never happen, but it just means that it's important to keep in mind that your administration, and in particular your superintendent, is on it. And if we had more time and we're doing more of this, I often talk about communication protocols. And we've talked about this before, but basically it's if every single one of you were to individually approach each one of your members of your central office team and ask questions and ask for information, it could make their jobs difficult to complete because there's a lot that they have to do on a day-to-day basis anyway. And so it doesn't mean that that will never happen, but I would recommend that you all come up with an appropriate protocol for approaching those central office administrators or principals or what have you, because of the burden that that could create. And because of the information that you might obtain through those conversations that could compromise your ability to not have conflict. Sharon, sorry, I see your hand up. Okay, to not have a conflict of interest, to not to come into possession of information you shouldn't have, like information about students, et cetera.
Actually, I have a question.
Sure.
So it's not so much to demand or ask something, but it seems well within bounds to say, hey, I ran into this New York Times article, kind of cool stuff, right? Or this agency, United States government said, hey, this is a cool thing to think about. Turns out it was HVAC related, right? So that's well within bounds, because it's like, I know as a group we'll discuss this, but here's something that's informative.
You mean to the board or to the
To the
administration?
administration or the board, whoever, receives like a New York Times link.
Yeah, so that's up to all of you. What I will say is that just be careful. This is something I'll make another point, a FOIA point. Electronic communications among a quorum of the board actually constitute an illegal meeting. So if you sent that New York Times link to your full board and one of them responded, you've now met illegally. It's a little ridiculous, but it's true. I mean, a more relevant example of that might be you saying, before the board meeting, I just want you all to think about this Title IX policy, and I'm not comfortable with the changes, right? And then Sharon responds and says, well, I disagree. It's legally required. We have to implement it. You've just had an illegal meeting.
But so the caveat, because I was thinking about it the other day when we had Lisa who joined the board, and there was an email sent out to all of us saying, Lisa is on board, da-da-da-da. If we respond to Lisa, not everyone else, and just say, welcome on board, that's fine. It's when we do the reply all that it makes an illegal meeting.
Right, or even the reply to a quorum of you.
Correct.
Yep.
Okay.
If I can add, I think that this board understands that really well. No, seriously, that often are all put for informational purposes only, and I remember would say, please don't respond. I think everybody kind of gets that now, which is great because, at the beginning of my tenure, it took a little bit of time and with new people coming in to kind of get that straightened out. So that's positive. I want to go back to the other point where if, let's say someone wants to share something, like let's say, Sharon, you have a great article on play-based education and the importance of unstructured play, and if you read in that, I'm making a pitch for the book, it's in chapter 11, that's in your bag, it talks a lot about that. If you send it, for example, to, Tina or members of the cabinet that kind of understand that, like a Tina CC'd me, and only because then I can perhaps use that as a springboard of conversation with Tina, or to Phil, or to, depending on what it is, or to Tracy, I think that that's good to share that kind of feedback. I think where it gets a little bit tricky is when you might email it to Tina and me and Linda Caird, a kindergarten teacher, and Laura Cadis, because then the poor teacher doesn't know, well, my goodness, who is this person? Oh, does this person expect a response? I want to be responsive. I don't know what to say. So that's kind of an example of when people are sharing things, I think it can get muddy because people want to seem responsive. I know, Tina, you've seen that, right? In some emails that you've gotten, and people are, is someone waiting for a response for me on this? So,
And what if you do it as a citizen, not on your Weston Public School email? I read this article in the New York Times, I sent it to you, you send it to their Gmail account, not their Weston Public School.
but I think it's, what is the intent? And a lot of times, sometimes there is no clear understanding of what the intent is to share it. And so then people could be put in the position where they don't want to look unresponsive, or this doesn't really relate to what they're doing, or this and that. So I think, saying something like, came across this and thought it was interesting, but I just know that sometimes it gets a little bit complicated because then we may get contacted, like, does this person want a response? What is this person, why am I getting this kind of thing? So it's just,
That's fair enough. And I think
Yeah.
we can easily rectify that by, if you have something that you just want to share for informational purposes, because I don't think that there's anything wrong with necessarily sharing it, putting caveat in there saying, no response required, just wanted to share this for informational purposes, found it to be interesting. Easy enough. So, okay.
Are we still in Q and A?
Sure.
I was going back to the code of ethics, and I could foresee a conundrum where we're asked as Board of Ed members to comment at a political event. So how do you handle that?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you're obligated, according to this, it should be thanks but no thanks. But that's sort of, you have people in the town that want to hear what you have to say. What do you do about that?
Which one are you looking at? I'm just,
I'm kind of looking at 9-ish and
oh,
5-ish at the same time.
right. So here's what I'll say about that, and we're in election season, so I've gotten a lot of these questions. I would recommend against a Board of Education member commenting on anything political or any election in their role as member of the Board of Ed. There's nothing to deprive you of your First Amendment right to speak up or offer support. Just don't say, as a member of the Weston Board of Education, I endorse so-and-so. That's what I recommend against. Now, people know that you are a member of the Weston Board of Education, and so where I see this coming up is members of the community saying, yeah, but Peter's a member of the Weston Board of Education, so clearly he's speaking in that capacity, he's wielding his influence as a member of the board to endorse this candidate. This is why you all have this code, which controls how you all want to work together to operate. Because if Peter does that, then that may lead Michael to say, you know what, I'm going to do that too, but for the other candidate. And then Lisa will jump in for somebody else. And it just creates the optics that you may not all feel comfortable with as board members. And that's really the challenge, as opposed to a legal prohibition.
Well, but hold on, are you asking about whether or not
Well,
they ask if
actually-
we endorse a candidate or something
Well, no,
else?
She actually introduced Part A and Part B. Part A was just politics and policies that are divorced from the Weston Public School District. Part B is actually commenting on the activity of the Weston Public School District at a political event. That's a little different. So I was actually
Oh.
looking for Part A and Part B. Part A is really pretty easy to say, look, I'm not going to comment because as a citizen I can, but not as a board member. Part B is a little tougher tightrope to walk because now you're being asked, well, tell me about the budget. Like, what do you do with that? Because you really, according to 8, you shouldn't say anything. You should take a pass.
Yeah, and I talked about endorsements just as an example, and also, by the way, there's a difference between you all, I think maybe some of you are independent, but you also have affiliations with your parties, and that's kind of a separate thing. But commenting on the work of the Weston Public Schools, that gets back to what we've been talking about in the Communications Committee, the role of the chairperson. Your chairperson is your spokesperson. If somebody asks you, what was the board's position on this, or anything, it's the same principle, which is you're not supposed to say, I think this, or, this may happen. You can summarize what already occurred. You can inform the community of, that the board is going to be taking up the issue at a future meeting. It's all the things that came out of the Communications Committee. But your spokesperson is your chairperson. And so what I would recommend if you're asked to do that is to say, well, and tell me if you don't want to be put on the spot, but I would say, why don't you speak to our chairperson? If you'd like to hear what our board is doing, then our chairperson gets the first crack at that.
I'm sorry, but I'm sure that, I know what goes on with the Democratic Town Committee, and I'm sure it goes on the Republican Town Committee. We're asked to comment on what's going on in our respective boards. We keep it high level, just we talked about X, Y, and Z without any follow-on opinion of what we think.
Yeah, I think there are a couple different pieces to this. There's that, which
Yeah.
makes sense, but then there's, and tell me if I misunderstood, an organization, I don't know, whatever, not political necessarily, says, hey, Peter, I want you to come and speak about what the Board of Ed thinks about this. I think the appropriate way to respond is to give your chairperson first crack at that. Right? But in any event, you know, Steve isn't going to go out and say something that the board itself hasn't already decided, right? Because that gets back to the idea that no one of you has individual authority.
But if we go, for example, if I were to go to the DTC, I could talk openly, well, I mean, clearly, nothing outside of executive session, but like I could talk about like what we discussed in the meetings and things like that. I could do that, couldn't I?
Yeah, I mean, I view that as more of you're playing a political role as part of your party than,
More of a caucus, I
it's
think.
more of a, it's not technically a caucus, but that happens, that to me is different than participating in a Weston community event.
Right. Okay, so you can go and talk about, this is what's happening. You can't, I guess you can't, can you say this is how I feel about it or not really, or, I don't know.
Well, you know what? I open that up to your views, because this is where you all have to come up with communication norms. And within your own party, your parties feel a particular way, and they may not feel the same way.
Right. That's tricky.
So, I just would be careful, because you still are, you are elected by, I get back to this idea, you are elected by the Weston community, but you are an agent as a board, you are an agent of the state. So you can say, you might say how you feel, but that really is not relevant to how the board might ultimately decide an issue, because you are one vote, and also you're supposed to draw your conclusions after deliberating with your other board members. You are a deliberative body, and so the idea that you come to the board with a political agenda and you're going to vote that way no matter what goes against this idea that you are an agent of the state and you reach conclusions after deliberations in open meetings.
Okay, that's fair. I'll just avoid the DTC meetings. No.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily saying that. I think it's just kind of a nuanced balance between recognizing what your role is and also understanding as a practical matter that you are members of political parties
No, I agree.
who nominate you.
I agree with that. I just think, you know, it's a tight line. It's a tightrope. Peter, you have it absolutely right as to what we can and can't say. I mean, it's almost got to be like toe the board line, you know, here's what the board is doing kind of thing, I would think. But I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I would say if I were going to say anything stronger than what I've already said is I would caution against saying, here's what I think should happen.
Okay, that's good to know.
I think it's fair to summarize what's
Because
going
They
on.
could be baiting them, and then they could put it in writing that this is you speaking on behalf of the board, and then that's really not the case.
Oh, you're
And
right.
that's- especially in that arena, you might be setting yourself up for potentially someone who might have your best interest at heart, but the reality is, they may be baiting you.
True.
And that does, to Peter's
mean-
point, go back to number 9.
Right.
Okay, all right, good to know.
I mean to speak out of turn, but that's
No,
what I'm
no, please.
interpreting that as.
Yeah, I mean that, and also the idea that you've developed your view before you've heard from your fellow board members. These are all the nuanced, this is the kind of discussion that that you all should be having, and I'm happy to be here helping to facilitate it, but these are the tricky ones. And this is why I think it's good that you have a code of ethics. This is really the platform that you have to think together, if you ever wanted to amend this. That would be the way to get into this discussion. Not that you should necessarily prioritize that on your policy agenda, because you have a lot of other things to work on, but this is what you all are supposed to live by for now. So I think you all do a lot with community engagement, and you have a communications committee that did a lot of good work. One thing that I will just flag, and I know we're running out of time, so I don't know that we have time for this discussion, but a lot of boards I work with ask questions about social media and what's the appropriate way to participate in social media as a board member, and what's the appropriate way, if any, to have private conversations with individuals about certain topics. So we can put a pin in that and circle back to it if you want to talk about that and if we have time. But that's the topic du jour in my experience. And then finally, just some reminders, which I've already shared about 24-25 planning. I've already flagged the important policy updates and the contract negotiations that are coming up. And it seems like you're all on top of HVAC inspections, but that's something that I wish to remind you of.
I have a question. Something that just actually arose, so I could take advantage of us discussing this. It has to do with the one about community, the W, engagement, and, you know, I really try to make sure that we are responsive when people raise questions, or, you know, sometimes, like just today, we got an email that was emailed to the entire board
to emails from parents, and I always just pick up the phone and you know, respond, because if people take the time to email, I think that, you know, I should pick up the phone and have a conversation or find a mutually convenient time to talk about it as soon as I can. Along those lines, and it's about the board meetings, you know, we have our agenda and we go over different committee meetings, and the committee meetings can also be like report out on the Weston Education Foundation, report out on CES and that kind of stuff. We have 2 high school representatives that come to the meeting and they report out on the high school at the beginning, and oftentimes they leave after that because of conflicts with their schedule. But recently the PTOs were saying, gee, we would love to be able to communicate more at a board meeting all the wonderful work that we're doing. You know, is this something that we could do? And they do so much, really, between the playgrounds to sponsoring Max Stossel coming to us in November and everything else. And I certainly want to share with their good work, but I'm thinking that perhaps instead of, you know, there's 4 different schools and all that, the way to maybe accomplish that isn't to have them speak at a public comment or whatever, and want to give you a heads up, but for me to also, under my superintendent's update, to report out on the PTOs. You know, it's like you want to be responsive to them, you want them to, they're looking for a vehicle by which they can communicate to the public. What are your thoughts about some kind of an approach like that, Jessica?
I have to think about that. The thing that's going through my mind is the PTOs are independent organizations.
Exactly.
And the reason I'm pausing is
Sure.
that you might, and I know they have a special relationship with the schools because they exist solely to serve your schools and to enhance the experience here. But there may be other organizations that feel that way as well. And
Well, exactly.
And you can control what you report out on. Can they make a public comment at the beginning? Sure. And you know, you probably have a limit on your total time of public comments, but they can get up at every meeting and say, I want to make a comment, and you have general non-agenda item public comment. So
Correct.
They could come up and, just like any other member of the public, report out. But I have to think a little bit more about having it be part of your update. Another concern I have, and this is probably a concern that only a lawyer would have, is that school, I want to be careful to preserve the line between school-sponsored and not school-sponsored. So sometimes the PTOs sponsor activities or events
Sure.
that really you don't want to have perceived as being school-sponsored because you don't want the liability.
No, I understand.
And so I just would want to be careful about
Yeah,
that.
no, I understand. That's why I figured I would raise it. But along those lines, I'm thinking, you know, we have a standing, what's going on with the Weston Education Foundation, and that's a town organization.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm just kind of thinking through some of these things,
I
so.
mean, it may be the kind of thing where if there's an update that you think is particularly important to share, as with anything, you
Sure.
can share it, but having it be a regular part of your reporting, I would just think carefully about that.
Okay, and
So-
to your point, we do have, we always recognize their gifts.
We do always recognize their gifts, and I act as a representative for WEF. Maybe what we do is we have a board member who acts as a representative towards the various PTOs, and we add it in at the end, like, is there a WEF thing, and, committee meeting. It's almost treated as a subcommittee, and we have a board member say, this is what's happening with the different PTOs. PTO presidents, either through you as a superintendent's report, if you'd like to do that, because you also meet with them more frequently.
Well, I meet with the presidents once a month, but I think we kind of need to think through a little bit
Okay.
of this, because I do worry about Weston Arts. There are a lot of other organizations, and certainly we want to highlight, the PTO's
They
great
do a
work
lot.
and everything.
They do a lot for the schools.
But nothing would stop them from coming to every meeting.
And making a public
And
comment
just so you know, the majority of the people in the audience at every meeting is a representative
from
of
the PTO, so maybe
that
that's
takes
the
notes to
vehicle by
report
which
back.
we
So
encourage
that's how I
them.
got involved. So I am 100% sure, that's how I got dragged into this. So I'm 100% sure that,
Okay.
they could easily come up and do the public comment too, if that's
Yeah.
where you guys want to go.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
I think either way, there's room for their good work to be shared.
I just want to add one thing. Since we did so much work on communication to open up lines of communication, be more interactive with the community, as you ponder what Lisa's asking, I would ask you to always err on the side of more information, more transparency, more communication, especially organizations like the PTO. They just do so much for us. And probably as the last group in town we really want to upset. But just as you look at these things, we did so much in communication to solve for some of the ideas that we weren't transparent. So let's not go backwards.
Yeah,
agree.
we don't want to lose ground here.
We don't want to lose ground, but at the same time, 7 o'clock, we have, how many hours, so it's a time thing as well. I'm all supportive of the 7 o'clock, but it is a time thing. We don't want to be here until 11:30 at night, with these meetings either. So finding a way to make sure that we're efficient.
Yeah, I think either way, it's just a matter of how that information is shared and by whom. But I see no reason why that information can't or shouldn't be shared. Other questions?
Just one other comment. In your folder, there is a paper called the Connecticut School Climate Standards. I think this is it's this one, if you're looking. It's separate behind the bylaws of the board. If you want to look at the bylaws, you can look at it online. But I think these are really powerful standards that we have. And this is related to the policies relating to school climate. And I would just encourage you to look at them. There are 5, because a lot of our work and where we are focusing on our efforts with school climate for next month, you'll see some of the same language, because I think it's important we align with the standards, which is the language in the laws and the policy. And there's some real powerful language of how to enhance what we're trying to do in the schools with different programs and everything else. So that's why I included it. You might want to, what is this? That's why I put it in there.
Jessica, I do have one question, just because you said put a pin in that. Coming back to your point about the query about social media and things like that, I think I said this last year at this exact sort of event we had, but just as a matter of practical wisdom on this, I would think that people can do whatever they want on social to have a nice life or something, but as it pertains to Board of Ed business or district business, it's just not the place to do it for, many of the reasons that are highlighted in my gift bag right here. But you give me some insight from other boards and stuff. What's your suggestion about how to, deal with that multi-headed monster?
Well, if I had my way and if my life were easy, I would say, don't engage about board business on social media if you're a board member. It's not that simple for a lot of my clients. If it's that simple for you, great. But if you are a board that wants to find a way to engage with social media about the business of the board, I would have a whole other set of guidance. I've had boards of ed adopt social media policies to regulate the way that board members interact with social media. But Chad, the way that you described it is what I recommend. You know, just stay away from using social media to talk about board business. Again, I'm going to look over at David, because we worked a lot on how the board is supposed to communicate about the board and how individual board members are supposed to communicate about board business. So then to go on social media and do something different is, I think, could create problems for the rest of you. And if one person does, here's the challenge I see. If one person does it, other people are going to want their views to be heard as well.
And just to be, this is not a problem we have, so I'm
Yeah,
not sure if,
So I'll stop talking then.
I'm only asking this because you said,
Yeah.
you said it in such a way that I was like, is there something that it's on your mind about it, or you've seen it in other districts?
Well, yeah, I see it a lot. I see it a lot, and it's great that it's not an issue here, because I do see that a lot. And sometimes I see it where there's one board member, right? Sometimes it's more than one, but sometimes it's one board member who is piping up a lot on social media, and the other board members are really itching to get their views out there, but they restrain because they realize that it could open Pandora's box. And by the way, that could also be a FOIA problem.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions?
Well, thanks, everybody. You know, this meeting has been a long time coming. I think it was originally posted for July, Jody? Posted on the Weston Public School website. And so we're a few months past July, but everyone's schedule came together. So thank you.
You wouldn't have had the education updates in July.
Would have been a shorter meeting. Thank you. Can I have a motion to adjourn? Second? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Great, thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
well done.